The Cold War started immediately after the end of World War II and continued well through the 1980s. This Cold War lasted for nearly 4.5 decades. The Cold War was fought between the United States and the USSR. But what makes it a Cold War? Cold means that there was no actual fighting. While there was no fighting, there was still a lot of military and psychological effects of the war. The war was made up of an arms race between the United States and the USSR to see who could build the biggest, most destructive hydrogen and atomic bombs. It was a war of ideology, of communism versus democracy, and it was a psychological war. There were several causes of the Cold War. The first cause was Stalin and the Soviet Union setting up satellite nations. As you can see, shown in the political cartoon below, Stalin stretched his influence so that it went all the way into Eastern Germany. He influenced Finland, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria. This inspired Churchill's term of the Iron Curtain, which also marks the second cause of the Cold War. The United States, Great Britain, and France, all democracies, wanted to be sure that the Soviet Union would not spread past its borders and into Western Europe. The Iron Curtain is a coin termed by Winston Churchill to represent the line that would separate communist East Europe from democratic West Europe. This wall can be physically represented by the construction of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Germany, separating democratic West Berlin from communist East Berlin. Here you can see Winston Churchill trying to peek under the Iron Curtain, and the United Nations trying to lift the wall with France, the United States, and Great Britain just looking on. The third cause was the United States' foreign policy of containment. This policy of containment would last the United States through to the 1980s and would see us getting involved in the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The goal of containment was not to stop communism, but was simply to keep it from spreading. This got us involved in many conflicts when communism was at threat of spreading, and we wanted to be sure to contain the spread of communism. The fourth cause was the Truman Doctrine. As you read in the documents, the Truman Doctrine wanted to give money to countries attempting to resist the Soviet Union, particularly Greece and Turkey. Again, this is following the policy of containment. A similar plan, the Marshall Plan, wanted to give money to all of Europe to rebuild after the war. This would be important because we wanted to be sure to support Europe before the USSR did, and also because it was important for the United States to be able to trade with other countries, as that is what our economic growth was built upon. Here you can see that the Marshall Plan, the rope labeled here, is helping pull Europe away from the Soviet Union. It was named after U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. The sixth and final cause we'll be discussing today of the Cold War is the reunification of Germany. Remember that in the Yalta Conference at the end of the European front during World War II, it was decided that Germany would be split into 4 zones, with each Allied country occupying one zone. After World War II, the zone of Germany controlled by the USSR became a communist nation, East Germany, and West Germany, controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France, remained a democracy. Likewise, the capital, well within East Berlin, was also split, so that West Berlin was democratic and East Berlin was communist. This is where the Berlin Wall was built, to keep those living in communist communist East Berlin from making their way into democratic West Berlin. Stalin, wanting to rid East Germany of all democratic followers, put a blockade in place so that those in West Berlin were not able to get access to food or other supplies. He cut rail lines and roads all leading into West Berlin in an attempt to get rid of the last democracies in Eastern Europe. The United States' solution to this problem was a Berlin airlift. The United States, for 9 months, flew from democratic West Germany into democratic West Berlin and simply dropped supplies to the people waiting there for food and other resources. Eventually, Stalin gave up the blockade, and West Berlin remained democratic until the fall of the wall. There were many organizations formed after World War II to try to prevent the spread of communism and protect the world from another world war. The biggest one was the United Nations, formed in 1945. The goal of the United Nations was to be an international peacekeeping organization. This is very similar to the League of Nations created by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. The one major difference is that in World War I, the League of Nations had no military support. The United Nations provides military support from the Security Council, a group of countries within the United Nations who have agreed to provide troops whenever needed to protect the interests of the United Nations. Other groups that formed were NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a defense alliance for all democratic countries, and as you can see, looking on the map, all of the blue countries, which are a part of NATO, are in the North Atlantic Ocean, hence the term the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These were countries like America, Canada, Great Britain, France, and other countries that were interested in protecting democracy. 6 years later, Stalin formed his own pact, the Warsaw Pact. This was made up of the USSR and all of Stalin's satellite nations as an alliance for communist countries and was in direct response to NATO. As communism spread throughout Asia, other organizations needed to be formed, such as SEATO. SEATO is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, formed in an effort to prevent the spread of communism after France left Vietnam. Additionally, the OAS was formed after Cuba became a communist nation to prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, so in North and South and Latin Americas. The Chinese Civil War evoked the domino theory in Americans. The domino theory is the idea that if one area becomes communist, all the other areas around it are going to fall as well. And given the policy of containment, the United States must get involved if one country was at threat of falling, because otherwise it would create a chain reaction. That is why the United States got involved in the Chinese Civil War being fought between Mao Zedong and the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The United States sent troops to support the nationalists, but the communists won, and China became a communist nation. Around this same time, the UN decided that the Jewish people who had been so mistreated by Hitler and the Holocaust needed their own country to call home. They carved Palestine up and created Israel. The new state of Israel was officially proclaimed as an independent Jewish state, and the U.S. immediately recognized it, but it immediately started causing problems in the Middle East as well. Arab nations greatly resented the decision on the part of the UN to give parts of Palestine to the Jews. This continues to cause conflicts through today. Another action that the UN took was in North Korea. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel, with North Korea attached to Communist China also being communist, and South Korea being democratic. Given the policy of containment, the United States would not get involved until North Korea invades South Korea in 1950. This war would last 3 years, with General Douglas MacArthur leading U.S. troops and other UN troops. North Korea is pushed back until China gets involved, and then the war is at a stalemate. The war would last 3 years. General Douglas MacArthur was eventually fired because he wanted to use the atomic bombs on China. MacArthur did not want World War III, Truman did not want World War III, so he fires MacArthur. The outcome of the war is that Korea remains divided at the 38th parallel, with the North being communist and the South being democratic through today. Another effect of the Cold War was the arms race. The hydrogen bomb, developed shortly after the end of World War II, was 67 times worse than the bomb used on Hiroshima. The United States developed this bomb in 1952, and the USSR developed this bomb in 1953. This leads to an ongoing arms race. Also, it leads to the policy of brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is using the threat of nuclear war to push what you want on the other country. So it is a bargaining tactic to try to get another country to do what you want with the threat of nuclear warfare. This slide shows you the effect of various bombs that have been created and detonated. What you can see over here, this little tiny dot has been enlarged over here. It is Hiroshima. You can see the little one next to it, the bunker buster. That's just your standard bomb dropped out of a plane in normal wars. So you can see how Hiroshima, which we know the death and destruction it caused, you can see how it compares to the biggest bomb ever made and detonated. When the Tsar Bomba went off, houses 560 miles away felt the impact, with windows cracking and shattering. People within 60 miles of the blast suffered third-degree burns from the intensity of the blast. No other atomic or hydrogen bomb has been used in warfare other than the 2 dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. However, the arms race gave rise to the Tsar Bomba, the largest bomb ever made and detonated. The U-2 incident was another effect of the Cold War and led to an increase in tensions between the United States and the USSR. During the U-2 incident, a U.S. spy plane was shot down over the USSR. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was taken prisoner. The United States asked for the pilot back. The USSR refused based on the fact that he had been spying. Again, this intensified relationships between the United States and the USSR. Lastly, in 1957, the USSR managed to launch a satellite into outer space. The satellite's name was Sputnik, and the launching of Sputnik started the space race. The goal of the space race was to be the country that was the first to land a man on the moon. In order to achieve this goal, the United States passed the National Defense Education Act in 1958, which put a focus on science in schools to try to turn America around and help America win the space race, which they eventually would in 1969 when Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were the first people to participate in a moon landing.